Few people realize this, but most people spend their entire lives conversing without truly understanding who is on the other side of the table. They ask direct questions, receive polite answers, and believe they have discovered the truth. But there's a problem. When someone realizes they are being analyzed, they automatically put on a mask. They answer what seems right, what seems acceptable, what preserves their image. And that's exactly why so many people end up trusting the wrong people, forming the wrong partnerships, or revealing more about themselves than they would like. But here's an old observation attributed to one of history's greatest strategists, Machiavelli. He understood something that many people still ignore. People rarely reveal their intentions when you ask them directly. Now think about this for a moment. How many times have you met someone who seemed trustworthy, only to discover months later that that person had completely different interests than what they said? Or perhaps someone who seemed friendly, but behind the scenes was always calculating their advantage. This happens because most conversations follow a predictable social script. People say what seems right. They maintain an appearance of virtue. They protect their own reputation. And those who don't understand the logic of human nature end up believing these superficial answers. But Machiavelli, who always advocated for a politics guided by reality, not ideals, observed something curious throughout his life. When you ask the right questions and in the right way, people end up revealing much more than they intended. And here's the fascinating part. Machiavelli realized that there are three seemingly simple questions that can reveal hidden desires, silent ambitions, and even fears that a person doesn't normally admit. Three questions that, when used intelligently, can show in a few minutes what would normally take months of interaction to appear. It's almost like seeing behind social masks. In this video, you'll discover what these three questions are, why they work, and how to use them to understand the people around you much better, whether in business, friendships, or professional relationships. Because when you learn to observe human nature clearly, you begin to realize something that strategists have always known. Those who understand people never play in the dark. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder you are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. First, he needs to understand something simple, but that almost no one realizes. When a question is too direct, the other person's mind automatically activates a defense mechanism. It's as if a small internal alarm goes off. The person stops answering honestly and starts answering strategically. They say what seems right, what seems acceptable, what preserves their image. And that's exactly why obvious questions rarely reveal the truth. Anyone who understands real human nature knows that the first answer is almost never the true answer. Think of a common situation. Someone asks, "Are you ambitious?" Most people will say something balanced, socially acceptable, neither too arrogant nor too humble. It's that appearance of virtue working in real time. The person answers to protect their own reputation, not to reveal who they really are. And those who study strategy, people like Machiavelli, know that human behavior always moves between two invisible forces, virtu and fortuna, ability and circumstance. Now consider a curious detail. When someone realizes they are being analyzed, they enter political mode, exactly like a ruler before a council of nobles. They begin to filter words, choose phrases, calculate impact. It's a small game of psychological power. The person thinks, what should I say to seem intelligent, reliable, admirable? And that's it. The truth gets lost in the middle of this social theater. That's why those who truly understand human strategy follow a policy guided by reality, not by ideals. It's not just what is said that is analyzed. It's what was avoided being said. And more importantly, it's the path the conversation takes that is observed. Anyone who has read Machiavelli's The Prince will find a clear lesson there. Successful leaders understand that decisions based on real human nature are always more effective than relying on speeches or appearances. And here's a fascinating point. When you ask a very direct question, the person responds with the persona they've constructed for the world. But when you guide the conversation intelligently, almost like a strategist moving pieces on a chessboard, something different happens. The person starts talking without realizing they're revealing more than they intended. It's the same principle as the calculated use of force. You don't push the door, you just turn the right handle. Imagine, for example, someone who wants to know if a potential partner is trustworthy. Asking, "Are you trustworthy?" reveals nothing. But a well-conducted conversation reveals thought patterns, priorities, fears, and ambitions. That's exactly where a skill that great strategists master comes in. Constant adaptability. Instead of attacking directly, they observe, guide, listen, and ask seemingly innocent questions. And curiously, that's exactly how Machiavelli developed a way to discover what someone really thinks, without directly asking about the person. There's a silent rule about human nature that few realize, but that strategists observe all the time. When a person talks about the world, they are almost always talking about themselves, not directly, but indirectly. It's as if every opinion were a small psychological mirror. When someone criticizes something intensely, there's usually a hidden personal story. When someone deeply admires someone, they are almost always revealing an inner ambition. And when someone judges something harshly, they are often trying to distance themselves from something they fear within themselves. That's why Machiavelli, a profound observer of human nature, rarely asked directly about the person. He asked about their world, about the people they admire, about the behaviors they criticize, about the kind of power they respect, because those who understand that decisions based on real human nature are more reliable than formal speeches know that people reveal much more when they don't realize they are being analyzed. Think about something curious that happens in everyday conversations. Someone says, "I can't stand arrogant people." At first glance, it seems like just an opinion. But a careful observer notices something deeper there. It could be insecurity, it could be competition, it could be an old wound. Judgment is rarely neutral. It almost always points to something internal. This principle appears in various areas of life: politics, business, leadership, and even relationships. Experienced leaders know this. They understand that the appearance of virtue often hides strategic intentions. And that's why they carefully observe not only what people say about themselves, but especially what they say about others. This is precisely why Machiavelli advocated a politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Because whoever relies only on words loses the game before it even begins. Now let's see how this plays out in practice. Imagine a casual conversation between two co-workers. One of them comments, "The problem with this boss is that he wants to control everything." Depending on the context, this phrase can reveal several things. Perhaps the person has difficulty with authority, perhaps they have leadership ambitions, or perhaps they value autonomy above all else. A strategist hears this phrase and begins to silently construct a psychological map. Not to manipulate, but to understand. It's the same principle used by intelligent leaders when assembling teams, choosing allies, or identifying potential conflicts. Because those who understand Virtù and Fortuna know that human relationships always involve a balance between ability and circumstance. And sometimes, to navigate this social game, it's necessary to remember another maxim attributed to Machiavelli. In certain environments, it's better to be feared than loved, provided one knows how to avoid being hated. And understanding what truly motivates people is the first step towards that. There's a question that seems simple, but has the power to dismantle social masks in seconds. When someone hears, "What would you do if there were no consequences?" something curious happens in their mind. For a moment, the person imagines a world without judgment, without social punishment, without fear of making mistakes. And in that small mental space, something rare appears, a glimpse of true desire. Not the desire that seems beautiful to others, but the one that is usually hidden. This type of question temporarily removes what Machiavelli would call the appearance of virtue. The person stops answering as a social character and begins to answer as a human being. This is precisely why strategists who understand politics, guided by reality, not by ideals, prefer indirect questions. They don't confront the person. They invite them to imagine. And when someone imagines total freedom, they reveal their deepest values. Consider a practical example. Imagine someone answers, "If there were no consequences, I would quit my job tomorrow and travel the world." This answer isn't just about travel. It might reveal a desire for freedom, dissatisfaction with routine, or even a wish for financial independence. Another person might say, "I would create a company and dominate my market." In this case, there might be ambition, a desire for power, or a wish to build something big. Notice how this question reveals internal priorities. An attentive observer understands that this is a small snapshot of what motivates that person. This type of observation follows an ancient logic. Understanding people requires looking beyond words. And those who understand Virtù and Fortuna know that human behavior always stems from a mixture of personal ability and external circumstances. That's why intelligent leaders always pay attention to what people want when they believe no one is judging them. Now here's an interesting detail that many people ignore. Some people don't answer this question immediately. They hesitate, they change the subject, they laugh nervously, and this reaction already reveals something important. Sometimes the true desire is so different from the public image that the person even has difficulty verbalizing it. It's as if there's a small internal conflict between who they are and who they believe they should be. Attentive observers know that this moment says a lot, because those who master decisions based on real human nature understand that silence also communicates. And often it communicates more than the answer. That's why social strategists develop constant adaptability in conversation. They observe micro-reactions, pauses, changes in tone. After all, in the great game of human relationships, where sometimes the end justifies the means, understanding hidden desires can be the difference between forming strong alliances or trusting the wrong person. There's a fascinating curiosity about the human mind. People rarely admire something by chance. Admiration is a silent clue. When someone talks about who they respect, who they consider inspiring, or who they consider powerful, they are revealing more about themselves than they realize. It's as if they are unconsciously showing the direction they would like to go. That's why social strategists casually ask this question, "Who do you admire?" It seems like a light conversation, but behind it lies a profound logic. Those who understand Machiavelli know that human nature reveals its desires indirectly. A person may hide ambition when talking about themselves, but they can hardly hide what they admire in others. And when someone speaks with a gleam in their eyes about power, influence, or freedom, that's not just opinion, it's projection. Consider a few examples. If someone answers, I admire entrepreneurs who build empires. Perhaps there's a desire for autonomy, economic power, or influence. If the answer is, I admire leaders who can command crowds, that person probably values authority and impact. Now, if someone says, I admire people who live in peace and don't worry about money, perhaps the priority is emotional freedom or security. Each answer reveals a hierarchy of values, and those who observe carefully can perceive something beyond the surface, because ultimately, virtue and fortune shape what each individual considers success. Some value power, others stability, others recognition, and understanding this difference helps to navigate human relationships with much more clarity. But here's a detail that experienced strategists pay close attention to. Sometimes the most revealing thing isn't who a person mentions, but who they avoid mentioning. Imagine someone who works in a competitive environment but never mentions strong leaders or authority figures. Perhaps there's discomfort with power. Now imagine someone who only mentions dominant and ruthless figures, generals, political leaders, conquerors. In that case, there might be admiration for the idea that it's better to be feared than loved, as long as one knows how to avoid being hated. Notice how this simple question opens a huge window into understanding someone's mindset. It's exactly the kind of observation that follows a policy guided by reality, not ideals. Because in the real world, whoever understands what people admire also understands what they seek, and sometimes the kind of power they are willing to conquer. Now we come to the question that many strategists consider the most revealing of all. At first glance, it seems like just casual conversation. What irritates you about other people? But those who deeply understand human nature know that this question opens a direct door to a person's inner world. Because criticism is rarely just criticism. Often it's a kind of indirect confession. When someone describes what bothers them most about others, they are revealing their insecurities, their fears, or even parts of themselves that they try to hide. That's why attentive observers, people who understand decisions based on real human nature, listen to these answers with much more attention than it seems, not to judge, but to understand the psychological map behind the words. Here are some examples that frequently appear. Someone might say, I hate arrogant people. Sometimes this reveals that the person values humility, but in other cases it may indicate something different, a fear of confrontation with dominant people. Another example, someone claims they can't stand lazy people. Perhaps there's a strong sense of discipline there, or perhaps a deep frustration with people who don't share the same level of ambition. Now imagine someone who says they are deeply irritated by manipulative people. Depending on the context, this may reveal a great sensitivity to power games, or even past experiences where trust was broken. This is why strategists who study Machiavelli know that human relationships always involve a careful reading of behaviors. After all, in any social environment, there is an invisible game of interests, influence, and protection of one's own image. And here an even more interesting detail emerges. Sometimes a person gets irritated by exactly what they themselves fear becoming. Someone who prides themselves on being extremely kind might get irritated by cold people. Someone who seeks control might get irritated by unpredictable people. At this point, a curious phenomenon arises. Criticism functions like an inverted mirror. What a person rejects in others often points to something they struggle to keep under control within themselves. It is precisely this type of perception that reinforces an old idea present in Machiavelli's analyses of power and behavior. Understanding people requires observing not only their declared virtues, but also their emotional reactions. Because in the great social theater, where the end often justifies the means, emotions reveal intentions long before words. Now that the three questions are on the table, something interesting begins to happen. Separately, each reveals a fragment of the person's mind. But when you put them all together, it's almost like a small psychological X-ray. It's like putting together a puzzle. The first question reveals what the person desires, even if they normally hide it. The second shows what they admire, that is, the type of success they consider legitimate. And the third reveals what they fear or reject, that which arouses irritation or discomfort. When someone observes these three answers together, they begin to perceive invisible patterns. It's exactly the kind of observation that follows Machiavelli's logic. Understanding people requires looking at real behaviors, not idealized speeches. That's why he always advocated a politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Because in the real world, people rarely reveal their intentions directly. Imagine a simple scenario to better understand this. Someone answers the first question by saying they would like to build a large business and achieve financial independence. In the second question, they say they admire strategic entrepreneurs and leaders who can firmly manage teams. In the third, they state that they are deeply irritated by complacent or unambitious people. Notice how the three answers connect. There is a clear pattern: a search for growth, admiration for leadership, and a rejection of stagnation. This small set of answers already reveals a lot about that person's psychological profile. An attentive observer realizes that this is probably someone results-oriented, someone who values autonomy and discipline. It is precisely in this type of analysis that the balance between virtù and fortuna appears, the combination of individual ability and circumstances that shapes human behavior. Now consider another example. Imagine someone who says that if there were no consequences, they would choose to live a quiet life away from social pressures. When asked who they admire, they mention people who prioritize peace and simplicity. And when talking about what irritates them, they say they can't stand competitive environments or overly dominant people. Notice how a completely different pattern emerges from the first example. Here, there is likely a profile that values emotional stability more than power or influence, and this type of reading is extremely useful in any social environment, business, friendships, leadership, or partnerships, because those who understand the logic of human relationships know that, in many contexts, it's better to be feared than loved, as long as one knows how to avoid being hated. And understanding the psychological profile of the people around you is one of the most important tools for navigating this game with intelligence and constant adaptability. Up to this point, it seems like everything depends on the answers, right? But here's a secret that experienced strategists know well. The answer isn't always the most important part of the conversation. Often, the real signal is in the reaction, in the tone of voice, in the pause before answering, in the nervous smile or the glance that wanders for a second. Anyone who observes human relationships attentively knows that the body rarely lies as easily as words. That's why people who deeply understand human nature, like Machiavelli, always paid more attention to behavior than to statements, because in the great social game, body language often reveals what the mind tries to hide. This observation is part of a policy guided by reality, not by ideals. Instead of relying only on what is said, you observe how it is said. Imagine the following situation. You ask the question, "What would you do if there were no consequences?" One person answers quickly, almost without thinking. Another laughs, pauses for a long time, and says something generic like, "Oh, nothing very different." These two reactions tell completely different stories. The first may indicate clarity of desire. The second may indicate fear of revealing something, or even difficulty in admitting certain ambitions. Now imagine someone who, upon hearing the question about admiration, immediately mentions powerful figures, strong leaders, or people who have gained influence. This may reveal a power or leadership-oriented mindset. It is precisely in this type of detail that the importance of understanding decisions based on real human nature appears. Because those who only observe words miss half the information. And there's an even more interesting point. Some people react with curiosity when faced with unexpected questions. Others become defensive. Others try to change the subject. Each of these reactions reveals something about how that person deals with psychological exposure. Someone very comfortable with themselves tends to respond naturally. Someone accustomed to power games might respond strategically. And someone insecure might avoid the topic. This type of observation requires something that strategists highly value: constant adaptability. You observe, adjust the conversation, change the pace, and remain silent when necessary. Because ultimately, understanding people is very similar to moving pieces on a chessboard. And as Machiavelli taught, those who understand human motivations between virtue and fortune, ambition and circumstance, can navigate social relationships with much greater intelligence. Now comes an important part that many people confuse. This method doesn't work like an interrogation. It's not about sitting in front of someone and firing questions as if conducting a police investigation. In fact, the power of these questions lies precisely in their naturalness. They arise within a common conversation, almost as genuine curiosity. This is how great observers of human nature have always operated. Machiavelli, for example, was not just a political theorist. He was a keen observer of human behavior. He understood that people reveal much more when they don't realize they are being analyzed. That's why the best strategy is to conduct the conversation lightly, almost as if exploring ideas. This type of approach follows the logic of a politics guided by reality, not by ideals, observing what people actually do and say instead of relying solely on the image they try to project. Imagine an everyday situation. You're chatting with someone at dinner, a work meeting, or even a casual get-together with friends. Instead of directly asking about ambitions or personality, you steer the conversation towards stories and opinions. At some point, the question naturally arises about who the person admires. At another point, curiosity emerges about what they would do if they had complete freedom. And at some point in the conversation, an observation about irritating behaviors in the world around them comes up. Notice how all this can happen without seeming like a psychological test. That's exactly where the method works. Because when the conversation flows naturally, the answers appear without excessive filtering. And those who observe attentively begin to perceive patterns of thought, values, and priorities. It is precisely this type of reading that helps leaders, entrepreneurs, and strategists make decisions based on real human nature. And here's a point that many people forget. Understanding people isn't just a defense mechanism, it's also a tool for building relationships. When you understand what someone wants, what they admire, and what they fear, it becomes much easier to build strong relationships, avoid unnecessary conflicts, and identify true alliances. That's why this skill becomes so powerful in leadership or negotiation environments. After all, in the great game of human relations, where sometimes the end justifies the means, understanding internal motivations can be the difference between trust and conflict. And as Machiavelli taught, navigating this game requires emotional intelligence, strategic perception, and a constant dose of adaptability. Because ultimately, every conversation is a small opportunity to better understand people's inner world. Now stop for a moment and think calmly. How many times have you judged someone solely by the words you heard? How many times have you trusted polite, socially correct answers, only to later realize that the reality was quite different? The truth is that understanding people requires something few develop: genuine attention. Attention to what is said, to what is not said, and especially to what appears between the lines. When you begin to observe hidden desires, silent admirations, and deep irritations, you realize that each conversation carries valuable clues about who is really in front of you. This is exactly what great observers of human nature, like Machiavelli, understood centuries ago. Human relationships are complex games, and those who understand the invisible movements play with much greater intelligence. Now, the most important question isn't about the people around you, it's about you. If someone asked you these 3 questions right now, what would your answers reveal? What would you do if there were no consequences? Who do you truly admire? And what irritates you most about other people? These questions aren't just for understanding the world around you, they also act as a powerful mirror for understanding yourself. Because deep down, when you start observing your own desires, ambitions, and fears, something interesting happens. You begin to see your own life more clearly. And those who develop this awareness begin to make decisions that are much more aligned with who they truly are. So now I want to know from you, which of these 3 questions made you think the most? Which one revealed something you had never noticed before? Write it in the comments, because sometimes a simple reflection can open doors that have been closed for years. And if you want to continue learning about strategy, human nature, and the ideas that shaped thinkers like Machiavelli, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. That way, you won't miss the next videos, and you'll continue developing a skill that throughout history has always separated ordinary observers from true strategists.